It's 3 minutes after 10 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. No prizes to everybody who's already pointed out to me that we have already got a cabinet minister on the record calling for a return of the death penalty or support for the death penalty. I don't think, was Priti Patel in the cabinet when she actually did that? She certainly wasn't Home Secretary, but no, Gary in Halifax and everybody else, you're quite right. That doesn't break my bet that it would be mooted as a potential policy proposal between now and Christmas. I don't think it will be, but I'm only about 48% sceptical. I think there's probably a 52% chance that it won't happen. It's a weird one again today. I've sort of thought about this a lot when stories appear in the news that we really shouldn't be talking about. And then you sort of think, well, it's government policy, and it is, therefore, something that we should be talking about. I don't know when it snaps. I don't think it can. I think this is part of the reason that Donald Trump is still dancing around America, claiming that he won the election. Our systems, I've mentioned this to you a few times, our systems are simply not built to cope with a level of lying that we're now seeing on both sides of the Atlantic. I presume that there are Conservative MPs looking at what's going on and just thinking, this is just insane. I can't actually break cover. I can't join the 20-odd MPs who have actually publicly acknowledged the existence of reality and announced that they can't put up with Boris Johnson for any longer because I'm worried about X, Y or Z, or I've got ambitions in that department, and what if he survives? Then my chances of promotion have disappeared. So there's reasons why people can't tell the truth. But joining in with the lies, there's like different levels of complicity, isn't there? I think silence is compliance in a way, but it's not as bad, surely, as actually amplifying or repeating the lies. And our systems don't know how to cope with it. The American Constitution, for all the sterling efforts of the founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton and his mates, the Constitution just wasn't designed to cope with somebody who would lie as freely and as easily as Donald Trump. And now we're seeing a sort of slightly watered down British equivalent in that I want to talk today about imperial measurements because the government has announced a review again into possibly bringing them back, but they have never been taken away. The front page of the Mail on Sunday yesterday claimed that the European Union had banned the use of the crown stamp on pint glasses, which is categorically and demonstrably untrue. I got sent a photograph of someone enjoying a pint in real time in Malta from a glass that had the actual crown stamp on it, and Malta is in the European Union. It also had the CE mark on it as well, which allows manufacturers to sell goods freely across 20-odd countries with no additional checks. But if you want to have a crown on it as well, you can. If you want to have Heineken stamped on the side of a glass, you can. If you want to have, I don't know, you don't have to be mad to work here, but it helps, stamped on the side of a pint pot, you can. So the idea that you weren't allowed to have a crown on it it's palpably and demonstrably ridiculous. But we live in a country now where it's front page news in what I think is the best-selling Sunday newspaper in the country. Do you see what I mean about the system not being equipped to cope with lying on this level? That's a major newspaper. So you look at it and you think, presumably, unless you're lucky enough to be tuned into this programme every day for your daily dose of truth and reality, you look at that and you think, well, sounds a bit rum, that. I'm sure I had a pint pot with a crown on it in Malta last summer when we were there on our holidays. But, well, I mean, this is a newspaper. They wouldn't be able to print abject rollicks on the actual front page unless there was a sort of scintilla of truth in it. Yes, they would. They would and they do. And that's why I sort of have a curious mixture of bewilderment and amusement on days like this. It's a little bit like looking at the picture on the wall and wondering why other people in the room are pretending it's a picture of a tractor when it's clearly a picture of a bloody horse. It's just bizarre to see the effort that people put into perpetrating these nonsenses. But then you have the other problem, and this is something I wrestle with wrestle's a bit strong. Tussle. This is something I tussle with quite a lot, is that should we talk about something that's obviously bonkers? But then I look back over the last few years and I think not talking about stuff that's obviously bonkers probably acts as a form of fertiliser on the bonkersness. And the bonkersness grows and flourishes, because those of us who care and know about the truth don't talk about it. And then you have the other problem, and this is something I wrestle with quite a lot, is that should we talk about something that's obviously bonkers? But then I look back over the last few years and I think not talking about stuff that's obviously bonkers probably acts as a form of fertiliser on the bonkersness. And the bonkersness grows and flourishes because those of us who care and know about the truth don't talk about it. because we don't think it's necessary in the face of so much public bonkersness. So I don't know what an example would be. We came a little bit late to the woke party, didn't we? This ludicrous confection, this invented problem that the country is somehow under threat from wokeness or from critical race theory or whatever other nonsenses people are coming up with to essentially just accrue power or money or profile for visiting like a sort of greatest hits of bigotry and bonkersness. So should we talk about the stuff that's bonkers? Or should we completely ignore it? And then, just when you think my burdens could get no heavier, and thank you for the epic amounts of sympathy and violin playing that are currently sweeping the country, just when you think my personal stroke professional burdens could get no bigger, you note that if the government is doing it, if they're turning it into a major announcement, if this is something that is being held up as a, wait for it, a benefit of Brexit, then you have to talk about it because it's actually in the national interest to point out how pathetic it is. It is, if you like, a sort of professional duty almost, surely, for you and for me to talk about reality when the major forces of government and media are increasingly dedicated to punting a completely alternative false reality where you couldn't put a crown on a pint pot for the last 20 years, where you couldn't buy a quarter of aniseed balls for the last God knows how many years, where somehow you had to leave the European Union in order to procure the vaccines that we procured a couple of years ago. It's all untrue. It's categorically and provably untrue. But the government are selling it to the people as something significant, something important, something to be celebrated. So that's why I think we have to talk about it. Would it be completely meta and absurdly self-indulgent of me to add that to the list of questions I'm about to ask you? Should we even be talking about this at all? 0345 60 60973. What's James doing on the radio today? Well, he's doing this topic, but the main point of the topic is to ask people calling in whether they should actually be talking about the thing he's encouraging them to ring in and talk about. You see what I mean about when does it snap? I mean, it snaps with scenes like the January the 6th coup attempt. I know that seems like quite a leap from a crown on a pint pot, but if you allow reality to go utterly ignored in this way, then eventually the blokes telling the biggest lies end up in incredibly horrible and dangerous positions. Rewriting the ministerial code last week, it popped out just after we came out off air on Friday. He's now rewriting the ministerial code so that if he's found to have broken it, there is a case for arguing he won't have to resign after all. I don't think it's quite the bonfire story that the immediate response, my own included, was on Friday, but it's certainly not a good look, is it? For a bloke who is clearly the most corrupt Prime Minister we've ever had, certainly the only one ever to have been done for breaking the law while actually in power, is now softening and diluting the code that is designed to keep ministers, including the Prime Minister, on the straight and narrow. So what do we do? Where do we go? 12 minutes after 10 is the time. Why are they doing it? Why on earth would a government facing a cost of living crisis... You've got queues coming out of Dover now that have prompted even Natalie Elphicke, a prominent Brexiter, to start complaining about them. You've got staff shortages that must have been exacerbated by the abolition of freedom of movement, causing flights to be cancelled while people are practically on the tarmac waiting to get on them. We've got energy prices set to go through another roof we didn't even know existed. You've got a cost of living crisis causing people to struggle even to feed their children. You've got food bank usage going off the scale. You've got all of the continuing noise surrounding all these parties that were held in Downing Street, including new evidence this weekend that Boris Johnson's current wife threw quite a big one on the evening of his birthday. You've got problem after problem after problem mounting up. And you've got half of the media talking about penises and half of the government talking about imperial measurements making a comeback despite the fact they've never been outlawed in the first place. It's a fascinating thread on Twitter that I've just shared that you should read, actually, because although I think this is an absolute hill of beans, the history of measurements and the importance of measurements is fascinating. A chap called James Vincent has written a an entire book about it. And the political and historical importance of measurements and how you measure things is probably best expressed by a very simple observation that we use the same word to describe a person that runs a country that we use to describe a length of plastic or wood that we use to measure distances. They are both called rulers. Isn't that interesting? It's no accident either. You go back to ancient times, and even pharaohs would have rods and measures in their pictography and some of the sort of pictorial representations of their power, because if you control the measurements, you control the people. Part of the aftermath of the French Revolution saw a replacement of largely arbitrary systems of measurement. If you're a duke, you could almost invent your own. I think the foot comes from the king's foot as a system of measurement. So the more widespread the agreement is for a system of measurement, the safer the people are. If I say that's 100 grams in Birmingham and it's also 100 grams in Budapest, think of the difference that makes to trade. You say that's, 3 ounces in Birmingham and it's 100 grams in Budapest. You've got a problem if you want to trade between the two. So, it looks absolutely riveting. If I'd noticed the thread a little earlier, I would have got the fella on. Here's an example of something from Magna Carta. There shall be 1 measure of wine throughout our whole realm, and 1 measure of ale, and 1 measure of corn, namely the London quart, and 1 width of dyed and russet and hauberk cloths, namely 2 ells below the selvage, and with weight, moreover, it shall be as with measures. Now, I would not be surprised if by tea time today, Jacob Rees-Mogg was calling for a return of ells and selvages, because there is something quite seductive about the sovereign nature of setting measurements. You can see how it speaks. So I was going to come on air and take the mickey out of it completely this morning, but this thread has given me pause. There is a historical context to controlling measurements at a time when the world was full of very corrupt people or very self-interested people trying to sort of act in their own interests. What we've done, or what this story today does, is cast us essentially as being desperate to go back to the days where a measurement would differ depending on what postcode you were in, rather than the post-French Revolution days where pretty much the whole world is agreed upon what you will get in return for your cash if it is being measured metrically. So, question number 1, and I am going to allow myself this. You don't have to join in, all right? I'd rather you did, obviously. It's a very odd way to earn a living if no one joins in. Question number 1 is, when the government come out with palpably absurd ideas like this, should people like you and me be talking about them? Does it actually benefit anybody? I think it probably does, the nature of this programme and the audience that listens to it. Probably some people need to have a little bit of help in seeing just how patronised they are being by government. So that's question number 1. Should we be talking about this mad stuff that they do solely to, well, because that's question number 2. Why do they do it? 0345 606 0973. I think it gets filed under blue passports, doesn't it? Why do people care what colour their passport is? Why do people in any way, because there must be some focus groups here that support the idea, what possible power can there be in the belief that we need to go back to the days when you were allowed to sell exclusively imperial weights and measures? Because the law at the moment, just so you know, is you have to have metric measurements on display for many goods, but you're perfectly free to have imperial measurements alongside them. So you can go into a sweet shop and ask for a quarter of aniseed balls. You can. I do it myself, not aniseed balls anymore. I'm quite partial to a Gray's Herbal Remedy, which is a West Midlands deliciousness. You can buy in Teddy Gray's in Bewdley if you're interested. You go into Teddy Gray's, they've got the 100-gram bags already measured out, but you can ask for a quarter of a pound of, if you were a bit weird, you could say, can I have instead of buying a pre-measured 100-gram pack, could I actually have a quarter of a pound? Because you'll get a few more, you'll pay a bit more for it. But so no one ever stopped you from doing it. There was metric martyrs in the early 80s. It's 10:18 already, and I've barely started on this, so I better pause briefly and invite you to ring in. What is going on? Let's have a Marvin Gaye kind of morning. What's going on? 0345 606 0973. Number 1, should we talk about this stuff? Number 2, why are they doing it? And number 3, if you really do care, if you are something, you're never going to ring me, are you? if you're somebody who really feels strongly that it is important and politically powerful to bring back freedom for shopkeepers to sell stuff without any reference whatsoever to the metric system, then please give me a call, because it's possible I'm missing something. I can't think what it is yet, but it's possible. 0345 60 60973. It's 10:18. 10:21 is the time. You've got to keep stating the bleeding obvious ad nauseam, James. Well, I hope not ad nauseam, Jack. I have a reputation to protect, to counteract the diversion and disinformation being promulgated by vested interests, whereas Philip takes the opposite view. James, you know the Imperial measures thing is a trigger issue, and therefore chaff do not engage. I don't know if it's a trigger issue, because as Kath has responded already, of course we should talk about it. Laughter is good for you, and I haven't stopped laughing yet. So why do they do it? And who does it? Who falls for it? If I mean, as I said a moment ago, I doubt you'll ring me yourself if you are the kind of person sitting there going, yes, they're going to have to remove potentially all metric references to metric measurements down the market when I buy my potatoes. But maybe you know someone like that. What? Why? Who? Just insert your own interrogative pronoun at that point. Robert's in Chorley. Robert, what's going on?
Morning, James.
Hello.
Second time caller here.
Welcome aboard. Oh, well, hang on a minute. What's that in Imperial?
I'll be a pair.
Carry on.
12 inches to the foot, 3 feet to the yard, 22 yards to the chain, that's a cricket pitch, 10 chains to the furlong, 8 furlongs to the mile, 1,760 yards to the mile. I'm a maths teacher. It is a ridiculous system that should just be allowed to die. It is an X system. It has shuffled off this mortal coil. But it does trigger a certain type of person who remembers the good old days when the world was pink and Britain ruled the waves.
I'm already, and inevitably, and no criticism of you intended, we're already in the realms of speculating about the motivations of other people, aren't we? I mean, because... And to be kind, there will be people, if this constituency exists, and you have to presume it does exist, because it comes up again and again, doesn't it? It comes round as regularly as Christmas, when the more desperate they are, the more likely they are to punt the old imperial measurements thing again. But it must be people who don't understand the facts, because it's never been taken away. All that changed was the legal requirement to have metric measurements in place, but there was never anything to stop you simultaneously having imperial measurements in place as well.
Why are you letting the truth get in the way of a good story?
Well, because me, mate. I can't help it. It's like some sort of personality disorder, and also because it's a front page news. So contempt for the comment, compassion for the con. You're a normal person. You're too busy to be digging into everything you see in the newspapers or googling it or fact checking it yourself. You've got stuff to do. You've got bills to pay. You haven't discovered LBC yet, so you don't know that there's an antidote to all. You don't even know you're being poisoned, let alone that you need an antidote. So I feel for the people that lap this stuff up, because, well, I mean, where does it end?
Well, there was the last caller on the show previously talking about how woke teachers are and how unwilling we are to challenge anything.
Oh, really?
Yeah, well, I just caught it.
Okay.
We're not,
and it appeals to that. It appeals to that mentality, does it? Is it? We need to go back to how things are. We need to get rid of teachers that care about children's welfare, go back to knocking them about a bit or giving them a slap, and therefore start selling aniseed balls in quarters again instead of in 100-gram bags.
Yeah, but I mean, we live in the 21st science, standards, international measurements, scientific. Science is the way forward. We're going to get, make things a better world. Kilometers. It tells you what it is. Kilometre. It means 1,000 meters.
I know.
Centimetre, millimetre. They tell you what they are.
Weights, maybe. Is there more of a case with weights than there is with distances? I mean, this story always seems to be more about weight. So one of the early catalysts of Brexit, according to people who watch this stuff quite closely, were the so-called metric martyrs of the early 80s. So weights more than distances. Is there more of a case there?
I will stay away from that one, but the weight system is completely ridiculous for Imperial. But yes, I think my grandmother I was too young to remember decimalisation, but I was alive when it happened. My grandmother hated it. It was too confusing, this simplified system we all love. But to her, the old money, 240 pence to the pound, farthings, guineas, shillings, halfpennies, farthings, that was just her normality. And I think if you're raised in it,
change is frightening. It's neophobia again, isn't it? Even if it makes much more sense. And of course, metrication started in the 60s before we'd even joined the EEC. So the lie after lie after lie. You need a proof, if it were needed, of how bonkers Brexit is now. So people still clinging to its carcass, what they offer up as wins. Lies about vaccine procurement, repeated perhaps inevitably in the comment pages of the Daily Telegraph today. I've said it before and I'll say it again. The comment editor of the Daily Telegraph commissions more comedy than Netflix, the BBC and Channel 4 combined, except he doesn't realise he's commissioning comedy, or she. And then the stuff now, at least with vaccines, you could see the point in lying about that to Brexiters. So we couldn't have done this if we were still in the European Union. We could, but you can see why it's a powerful lie. But lying about this, we couldn't have done this if we were still in the European Union. We could, but people care enough about a crown on a pint pot? 0345 6060 973. Thank you, Robert. Some praise for Robert from Nigel, not that one. How can I not love your show? Talking about the proposed reintroduction of imperial measures that were never taken away, and a caller references Monty Python's Dead Parrot sketch. What's not to love? Well, I tell you, John Cleese coming up on Full Disclosure in August, all being well. It's taken a while to pin him down because he spends a lot of time in Los Angeles. But there you go, Nigel Boone in Belfast. That should give you something else to pop in your pipe this morning. Ben's in Alicante in Spain. Ben, what's going on?
Well, firstly, I think you're absolutely right to be talking about this. I mean, I think talking about this doesn't preclude talking about the sensible stuff. In fact, I think it actually encourages people to. Like your last caller, who was superb, by the way.
He was, wasn't he?
The mathematician.
Yes.
He explained why it was so important, why the ridiculousness of it is crazy, and why it's important to talk about the sensible stuff. But the slightly more important point I have to make, at least,
yes, go on,
is I think the reason they do this stuff is not. It's to have this continuous war of attrition with Brussels, to make it look like we're always fighting the EU.
Yes.
I don't think they want to get Brexit done. I think the purpose of this kind of stuff is to sort of remind the people that voted for Brexit in the red wall seats, if you like, but also down south where I come from, that we're always at war with the EU. There are these evil puppet masters in Brussels, and we must somehow be fighting them. That's why I think the Northern Ireland Protocol, I don't think that they'll ever initiate the Northern Ireland Protocol. I genuinely think it's just a way of making us feel like we're still at war with this.
Isn't that in 1984? We are always at war with Oceania or something like that? Isn't that part of the 1984?
Yes, it is. Yeah, they'll often change. I mean, they'll sometimes they're at war with Oceania, sometimes they're at war with East Asia, but they're always at war with somebody, because you need something to deflect the attention. Because your introduction was brilliant, by the way, where you said, look, there's always genuine problems.
Yeah, I know.
We've got terrible problems in the UK. I mean, shocking problems.
I was the editor of the Mail on Sunday yesterday. So you've got. I mean, the corruption in Downing Street. I know they put a lot of effort into pretending that it doesn't matter if the Prime Minister is a law-breaking liar, and it seems possible that his wife is as well. She's certainly a lawbreaker, and she's throwing parties in the flat. So I can see why they pretend that doesn't matter. It takes a little bit of. I don't know quite what the word is, but then you start looking at the news agenda and you start thinking, well, we've got the cost of living crisis, we've got the war in Ukraine, we've got this, we've got that, we've got this, we've got that. I know what we'll put on the front page. A blatant lie about crown stamps on pint glasses.
It's completely extraordinary.
It is, isn't it? Really is. I mean, and if we don't talk about it, it goes unchecked. So even though, by my logic, I should be talking about the war in Ukraine or the cost of living crisis, and I will, but I'm talking about this now because if we don't, then the lies get 3/4 away around the world before the truth has got its trousers on.
I was sitting in Benidorm yesterday with a bunch of 20-year-olds who were kind of like reading the Mail on Sunday, and we all go to the same gyms often, and they were 20-year-old English guys.
Yes, of course.
And 20, 30-year-old English guys, and they're all going, well, what's wrong with that? And I'm saying, well, A, we could have always done it, and B, and then I started doing what I looked it up on the internet, what these measurements actually meant. And at one point I said the word LB, meaning pound. Yeah. And this bloke said, what the heck is an LB? I said, well, that's what you're defending at the moment, LBs.
Doesn't know, though, because he thinks he's somehow taking up arms against the Brussels bureaucrats while living in, or maybe they were on holiday, in Spain. I mean, why do they do it? 0345 6060 973. And who does it appeal? Does it actually appeal? Are these people real? The blue passport people, I always thought you could probably count them on one hand. I'd much rather have a passport that has considerably less power but is a different colour from the more powerful passport that I had before. What's the point of a passport? To be a sort of Dulux colour chart, or to get you free access into as many countries as humanly possible? It's 10:31. Dominic Ellis is here now with your headlines. 10:35 is the time. And look, here's another example. So the pint pots on the front page of the Mail on Sunday yesterday. Here's someone called Robert Toombs writing in the Daily Telegraph today. I'm not going to tire of pointing out to you that the comment editor of the Daily Telegraph commissions more comedy than Netflix, the BBC, ITV and Channel 4 combined. So here it is. Despite the collapse, under the headline, Brexit is the Tories' golden ticket out of scandal and incompetence. I mean, not for the first time. It's the satirists you feel sorry for. And here it is. Despite the collapse of the Remain campaign's predictions of disaster. So they would be predictions including perhaps threats to the peace process in Northern Ireland, increases in the cost of food, huge difficulties regarding import-export, massive queues at Dover, labour shortages because of the abolition of freedom of movement. I mean, no one ever actually predicted World War III. That was a lie that Boris Johnson told to misrepresent something that David Cameron had said about the successful role that the European Union had played in keeping peace across Europe for 50 years. But there are plenty of people in Ukraine, including the president, who think that World War III has already started. So quite what those predictions were, those predictions of disaster that haven't come true, I'm not entirely sure. We've got the highest inflation in the G7 by some distance. Anyway, so I think that's just a lie, isn't it? And then this is my favourite. Despite the EU's failure over COVID vaccines, which Brexit enabled us to sidestep. Right, number one, the last time I checked, there were 13 EU countries, plus Norway and Iceland, which had a higher proportion of their populations fully vaccinated. And number two, the head of the UK medicines regulator pointed out at the time that what the UK did, everything the UK did, was permitted under EU law. So this fella is an academic. I think he's a professor at Cambridge or Oxford of French history. And he's writing in the Daily Telegraph stuff that is demonstrably untrue. If an undergraduate submitted an essay to him containing claims that you simply have to have the barest grasp upon the facts to know are untrue, one imagines he would fail his own students. But here he is repeating demonstrable untruths. I suppose you could file the failure of the Remain campaign under opinion, but Brexit enabled us to sidestep over vaccines when the head of the UK medicines regulator has said that's not true. It's very tricky, isn't it? And that, I suppose, is why we have to talk about it. Now, this is very gratifying. I mentioned James Vincent to you about 20 minutes ago because I already followed him on Twitter, actually. So he must have been brilliant at some point in the past, which prompted me to click on the follow button. But he posted an absolutely fascinating thread that was only partly designed to flog copies of his imminent new book, which is out on June the 2nd. And it detailed, I mean, truly riveting history regarding the role that weights and measures have played really throughout history, going back to when it first started being recorded. And I'm delighted to say he's rung in from Farringdon. So, James, congratulations on the imminent publication of your book. You must be absolutely delighted that it somehow made its way back onto the front pages, the conversation about Imperial versus metric.
Thank you so much for having me on, James. Yeah, my publicists at Faber obviously need some sort of a bonus for engineering this right during publication week. I couldn't be happier.
And listen, we're having a conversation at the moment about the political motivation behind this ludicrous reinflation of an ancient story. But I was so intrigued by the thesis behind your book. I can't expect you to summarise it in minutes on the radio, but I'm going to ask you to try and give me some really juicy examples of the role that it's played in. I wouldn't call it population control necessarily, but sort of, I mean, governing itself, isn't it, in its purest form?
Yeah. I mean, the thesis behind the book is just that measurement matters, and it's something that we don't think about enough, we don't talk about enough. On this thread, and I want to keep this, my opinions on the political expediency of what Johnson's doing this week are very different to my understanding of the sort of history of it. But in the thread, I just pointed out that looking after weights and measures, standardizing units of measurement is something that's just been absolutely essential to the functioning of states for millennia. For as long as we have recorded history, we know this has been a concern of leaders of governments. And it's not the same concern that it was in the past now, because essentially the success of the metric system has meant that we all have something, or most nations have something, that they can agree on is a fantastic system, and it's practical, and it fits all these different scenarios and environments. But we look back at the history, and the quite recent history, the last couple of 100 years, and control of weights and measures has really been an incredibly important topic for political sovereignty. And in the thread, I talked a little bit about how the metric system was invented during the French Revolution and was directly tied to the political aims of the French revolutionaries. It was designed to, revitalize the sense of society. It was designed to help citizens calculate in their own interest. That's one of the things that they say about it. But also, as the metric system spread, it really did spread with Napoleonic conquests. And it was something that was imposed at the end of a bayonet, to quote one historian. So this is something that, it's not something we go to war over necessarily, but it's something that is settled by war. So I can really see why exactly the Tories have chosen to leap upon this subject, because although it seems dry and it seems abstract, it's actually something that's really close to our everyday understanding of life.
Because it allows the perpetuation of the myth that we're under a sort of jackboot of bureaucracy here, even though the adoption of it, as you will know, had nothing to do with European Union membership. And metrication started in the 60s, but it speaks... Does it speak to the same emotional impulse as the colour of a passport? The idea that it is, well, it's sovereignty, isn't it? In its simplest sense, in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as part of the research for the book, I hung around with a group called Active Resistance to Metrication. I don't know if you've heard of this lot. Have you ever come across these guys?
Not yet. No, they may have rung me on occasion in the past, but I don't know if they disclosed their membership.
I would bet they have, because they are fanatics, but they're fanatics with clipboards, which, sometimes those are the worst types. But no, they were, I don't want to badmouth them, because they were very kind to me and talking to me and hanging around, and they were great. I really respect their views. But basically their thing is that they like going around the country and taking down metric signposts, or signposts that are labelled in metric units. And they either take them down in the dead of night and hide them in hedgerows, or they replace the metric units with imperial units. And sort of understand the motivation behind these sorts of people. I went on one of their raids with them in Saxted, which beautiful little village, and home of Holst for a while, and he wrote part of the Jupiter Planets suite there and all that sort of thing. Anyway, we went to the pub, we had a few pints, we talked about the problem with metric units, and then we
you had a few what?
We had a few good old English pints.
So you can still do that. I never visit pubs. You can still buy a pint, can you? I mean, reading some of the coverage in yesterday's newspapers, you could be forgiven for thinking that had been outlawed in 1973.
Exactly. But what these guys got through to me, and what I found really fascinating, and what makes me sympathetic, although not, some degree of sympathy for these people who are worried about this stuff, is just how much it means to the cultural heritage, and the idea that that these units go back, not thousands of years, but hundreds and hundreds of years in the UK. But on the other hand, as you rightly point out, no one's trying to take away pints from pubs or anything like that.
I hope you're selling a lot of books, and I'll plug it again at the end, because clearly you've come to it with a very clear eye and a warm heart, sympathy for people pursuing positions that are, I think we could say, eccentric, couldn't we, in the kindest sense and the nicest sense of the word, but which are not without foundation. I've checked, so I'm not going to pretend that I haven't. I've read the whole thread, but at some point in this conversation, if I hadn't read the whole thread, I might have said something like, I imagine people like Tucker Carlson will be jumping on this bandwagon soon. And then lo and behold...
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's almost... We think we've got it bad here in the UK, but honestly, it's so much more of a problem in the US. And this is despite the fact that both the US and the UK, for all the chat we're having now about these measures being restored or whatever, both these countries are metric at heart. Yes. They all define their units based on the metric standards. I think in the US that was established back in 1893 or something like that. And it's because the Bureau International de Poids de Mesure, which is the group based in Paris who
sounds a bit foreign, James.
It does sound suspiciously foreign, doesn't it? I was just thinking that, James. Because that group, they look after the metric standards and they do such fabulous scientific work and real cutting edge stuff that those standards are unimpeachable. And that means the US and UK, for all this faff and palaver we're talking about now, they've actually been metric for more than a century.
What do people like Tucker Carlson pose as the threat? Because they've never been members of the European Union. So what's the mythical threat that he is brainwashing his viewers with when he rages against the metric system? Do you know?
Carlson has two main problems.
Right.
Top of the list is that it's French.
Okay.
And below that is that it's an atheistic imposition. So this is a really fascinating strand of this history, and I hope you'll indulge me for a second on this.
Yes.
Thank you. Which is basically that there's long been, because the metric system was created during the French Revolution, which obviously had very anti-religious overtones, shall we say, that's sort of understating it a little bit. There's been this long association in anti-metric groups between the metric system and atheism, essentially. And it sounds really bizarre when you frame it like that, but because it came about during the French Revolution, this connection was made years and years ago. And there has been a long-standing conspiracy theory, which was sort of quite popular in the 19th century, that the inch, particularly, was a divine unit bestowed on humanity by God.
Wow.
And that to change it was to go against the natural order of the world. And this belief was strengthened by a pseudoscience called pyramidology, which is all based around measurements of the pyramid. And these folks, they went off to the pyramids, they went off to Egypt, they measured them, and they said, oh, look, we found all these fascinating truths that are hidden in the stones of the pyramid, the Great Pyramid at Giza. And one of the things they found, or thought they found, was that the inch has been encoded in these stones. The pyramids were designed by gods, and they were designed to maintain this sacred unit of measurement throughout the centuries. And so, yeah, that's Tucker Carlson. He's buying into that.
He knows exactly what he's doing, of course. James Vincent, you sound like, and I mean this most sincerely, you'd be a fascinating bloke to go for 0.568 litres of beer with.
Anytime, James, anytime. You or your listeners.
And Beyond Measure by James Vincent, you can order it now. It's out on June the 2nd, which means it will be, you could not plan it better, as he mentioned, that it will be arriving in bookshops as this relatively ludicrous conversation continues. But I told you he was fascinating, didn't I? You see? It is 10:47. 10:51 is the time. Was there ever a different... There was no... sundials, I suppose, but they still worked on the same principle. I'm just wondering if they could announce, if things get really desperate, if this Abbot party that the Prime Minister's current wife threw on I think that was the night that Dominic Cummings got fired. Amazing detail in the Sunday Times yesterday on this. There are clearly people still aboard the bandwagon, desperate to get off it, but they'd rather that they could do so when the bandwagon had come juddering to a halt, rather than jumping off it while it's still careering at full speed ahead. But I don't know what's the next bad thing that can happen. What would they announce then? Oh, rats, Jacob, we've already used up the Imperial measures thing on last Sunday's pay. We've done the panic. Can we send Pretty out to propose a return of the death penalty? She'd probably be up for that. She did it on Question Time once, got absolutely destroyed by that dreadful Ian Hislop fellow. The cat o' nine tails? Birching people? Public displays of corporal punishment? What could they do? Who sits there on a day like today and goes, yes, they're bringing back imperial measurements that were never taken away in the first place. Go us, winning. It's just baffling. But at least we've discovered that rather brilliant book that James Vincent just told us about. 10:52 is the time. I'd love to see the stats for how many people order it as a consequence of hearing that brilliant little précis in the context of this relatively ludicrous conversation, which I think we can agree now that we have to be having. Speaking of statistics, here's another really interesting thing. The Times, pick up where we left off on Friday, said on Friday, cautiously, we're going to have to start talking about immigration again soon. A, because it's set to be higher than it was before Brexit, which means that the people who were promised a reduction in the number of foreigners coming here either have to stop being so racist or have to have their voices heard. I'd obviously much rather the former. And B, because it's an employment issue. I really stumbled across a phenomenon on Friday. I don't know if you were listening, but then I see all the problems at the airports today, staff shortages throughout the airline industry. People are leaving work. The people lucky enough to be able to knock it on the head are knocking it on the head as a consequence, perhaps, of employers in this country in particular having way too much power and employees having none. Just look at the reaction to one of the few sectors of our workforce that still has a little bit of agency, a little bit of power, a little bit of energy to exercise, railway drivers, threatening industrial action. And look how that is responded to by the people who told you to vote for Brexit and put Boris Johnson into Downing Street. They hate the idea of the workforce having any agency whatsoever. They'll pretend that they care when they're talking about working from home. They'll say, what about railway drivers? They can't work from home. That's not fair. And then when train drivers turn around and say, actually, we're being treated really badly. We deserve a pay rise. Look at the profits that are being made by the people that own the privatised railway companies. Why aren't we seeing any? Oh, down with them, they're awful. But here's some statistics for you to chew on. May 2016, figures released showing that net migration was at 333,000. Boris Johnson said publicly, there's no public consent for the scale of immigration we are seeing. The situation is completely out of control. That figure now set to be exceeded while Boris Johnson is in Downing Street. Something I'm relatively comfortable with, although I don't understand why the numbers coming in are going up, but the number of job vacancies being filled is going down. But I presume an awful lot of people who voted for Brexit, including the 60% who said they thought there'd be less immigration into Britain if we left the EU, are going to want Boris Johnson to answer their questions sooner rather than later. Camille is in Watford. Back to measurements, Camille. What would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello, mate.
First time calling in.
Welcome aboard.
On a terribly grey morning.
It's not great, is it?
No, it's pretty terrible. When is this summer actually going to start? So, yeah, I think, to be honest, I don't think anyone cares.
Well, some people must, mate. It doesn't end up on the front page of the Mail on Sunday unless it's been focus grouped or, some people do care. You don't know them. I don't know them. They don't ring me anymore, but they definitely exist.
That's fine. There will be some. You're right. You're absolutely right. There will be some few that will care about these things. I guess, I would expect the average person whose bills are affected and, who sees the moral degradation at the top won't care about these types of things, the things that we already have and we don't actually need to change. I feel like, me and by extension, my family, yes. I would say, I can speak for them. We have many, many conversations about this. We wouldn't care about this. What we care about is, helping the average Briton to.
But if you care about that stuff, and this, of course, would increase costs if they're going to also limit companies from being able to export stuff. No, they wouldn't be limited from exporting stuff. Well, it would have to have the CE mark on it. So, yes, it would limit them from being able to export stuff into the biggest single market in the world, which doesn't sound to me like a good way of doing business. But you have to talk about it, I think, because...
Yes, but do we have to talk about it over the change of the ministerial code, for instance, or,
I've already spoken about that in the same context that you are, saying that these things are clearly measurably more important. But if the government is announcing this stuff, then you have to address it. Because if you don't address it, it gets 3/4 of the way around the world before the truth has got its trousers on. If people are being lied to about X, talking to them about Y doesn't help them see the truth about X, does it?
Well, no. No, you're absolutely right. But then
I give this quite a lot of thought. I'm sometimes wake in the night worried that we shouldn't be talking about their latest lies, because by talking about their latest lies, you kind of give them some credibility. You give them some validity.
Yeah, but at the same time, by talking about, these things which are clear, yes. I would say pandering. It's clear pandering to the Brexit side of the vote.
Maybe, but I know. I take your point. I'm not just going to try and squeeze in one more, but I think that actually, and I get this a little bit when I look at the replies on the LBC page. People aren't engaging anymore. They're just saying, "Shut up! Shut up! Stop talking about this stuff! Shut up!" Which has got to be closer to admitting the truth than going back today saying, "Ha ha ha! We won. You lost. Get over it." Now it's just, "Please stop talking about reality," which has got to be a progress from denying it. So I don't know. I think we have to keep chipping away. Last word on this to Steve in Catford. Steve, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello,
Brilliant
Steve.
show.
It's all right.
It's great. It's great.
Oh, go on then. You can have that one.
Yeah, you've got to talk about this. What you just said, really, I think absolutely bang on. You've got to talk about it. They're lying. But my little story is a fake nostalgia that they're trying to pander to as well. In the 60s, when I was a little boy, a little child, we used to have a gathering of the clans every Saturday, fish and chips. And if I managed to get a beer to Uncle Sid, he'd give me sixpence or threepence or a shilling, whatever was in his pocket. And, maybe I'm of the age where I'll think, I do miss that.
Yeah.
It's lovely. It's a lovely memory, but it's not.
But it's more a memory of your Uncle Bob than it is of the actual coin in your pocket. And if he'd given you 50p, you'd have been just as happy 10 years later as you were with us with sixpence in 1962.
Absolutely.
It's bizarre, isn't it? I'm a member of a Facebook group that is, I love it actually, and I spend way more time on there than I ever would have believed possible. And it's old pictures of the town where I grew up. And a lot of chatter on the fellas that run it are really strict about not letting people do what you've just described. Because if you do, and everyone goes, "Oh, I can't believe they pulled that down," or "We never should have done that," and if you do that, it gets swamped. And I didn't understand why they were so strict about it at first. But nostalgia's not. You can't blame people for being nostalgic. What you don't mention is that some of these pictures, we still had rationing when it was taken. The kids had rickets and all sorts of, the life expectancy was a fraction of what it is now. So that's polio. What you're talking about. Polio. Let's bring back polio. Take back control. Let's bring back polio. I mean, I do
remember. I'm old enough to remember kids that had polio, and they had the big shoes and the braces on their leg. And for God's sake, we've moved on, and we're sort of in many ways a better country. But the last 10 years
just appeals to some weird, and of course, the more you try to pin it down, the more ridiculous it looks, which is why you have to pin it down. And although it doesn't stop us from talking about other stuff, there are days when you have to point at the emperor. You just have to point at the emperor and say he's not got any clothes on. He's not wearing any clothes. I don't care if it's on the front page of the Mail on Sunday saying, "Behold, the Emperor's marvellous new robes." I don't care if it's in the comment pages of the Daily Telegraph saying, "These robes are really marvellous and they prove that Brexit was a brilliant idea." I don't care if it's in the Daily Mail saying, "Keir Starmer doesn't even like the robes. Old Keir Starmer, old anti-robe Starmer. He's so wokey, anti-robe Starmer." Some days, most days, possibly every day, you have to sit here and you have to say, there aren't any robes, there aren't any clothes, the Emperor is stark, rollick, naked. 4 minutes after 11 is the time. A few of you asking why we don't go in harder on the Prime Minister's current wife. The answer is simple, usually, because I know it's trending and I know there's all sorts of stories around at the moment. I mean, one's in the public eye involving parties and strange text messages, and my thought has always been she's not in the job, so therefore she doesn't deserve the levels of attention that you deserve and receive when you are in the job. But then again, if some of the excuses or some of the explanations given up for not pursuing these parties further is that they were work meetings and she was there, then things get even murkier and even more confusing. So that's my current thinking, although it's not necessarily a position that I'm going to remain welded to for the foreseeable future. There is a breathtaking piece on the front of The Guardian today, and perhaps inevitably, when I say that there's a breathtaking piece on the front of The Guardian, you will know that it has the byline Amelia Gentleman on it. Certainly when I mention the word Windrush, you'll know that Amelia's work will be speaking truth to power in that field. I'll give you the quick headline and then Amelia will talk us through the detail. So the Home Office, the actual Home Office, right? This current iteration of the Home Office, presided over by Priti Patel, commissioned a report into, the roots of the Windrush scandal, why there was an environment in place, why there was a system in place that could have allowed the Windrush scandal to occur. Looking for the origins, if you like, of that bureaucratic breakdown. The conclusions of the report are astonishing. It's been written by an unnamed historian. It runs to 52 pages. And I say astonishing. This will come as a surprise to 99% of black people listening to this programme, and probably 48% of white people, because they found 30 years of racist immigration legislation designed to reduce the UK's non-white population. I'll say that again. Commissioned by the Home Office, the conclusions found that 30 years of racist immigration legislation was designed to reduce the UK's non-white population. And Amelia Gentleman joins me now. How come we have to rely upon you to find this out? Why hasn't it been published?
Yeah, hi. So that's what's the really, really peculiar thing about this report. It was commissioned 2 years ago by the Home Office, as you say, as part of a kind of self-education, self-awareness process. It was delivered by the historian a year ago, and it sat on a desk somewhere without being published internally for a year. And it's really, really peculiar. The findings of the report are very, very striking and very hard-hitting, but probably immigration historians, anybody who studied 20th century history, will not be amazed by the findings. The thing that's really odd is that the Home Office tried to bury it.
So they were expecting a different result. I mean, this is the same government that commissioned a report into systemic racism and was delivered a report that could be spun in a way that suggested there was no such thing as systemic racism. So I know you don't really indulge in this sort of thing, but it's hard to avoid the conclusion that they haven't published it because they didn't like the results, isn't it? I mean, just sort of Sherlock Holmes is, once you've eliminated the impossible, whatever you were left with.
Yeah, no, it's really, really odd because it was commissioned as an educational tool, and then it wasn't made available to even internally until it was prodded into publication. And we at The Guardian, we tried to get hold of it through a Freedom of Information request, and the response came back that there was material in here which was not appropriate to be in the public domain. And it's true. I mean, the report is really, really starkly written. It points out that immigration passed between 1962 and 1971 was designed to reduce the proportion of people living in the UK who did not have white skin. And it summarises how the British Empire depended on racist ideology in order to function and produced legislation aimed at keeping racial and ethnic groups apart. So again, if you're a historian, if you've thought about the history of empire, this won't come as a surprise. But what's unusual about it is to have a Home Office document that states it so boldly, and then to see that document buried by the same people who have commissioned it. It's really, really odd. Commissioned
as part of an attempt to educate or illuminate Home Office staff, 35,000 of them, in the history of colonialism and the history of Black Britons, in the hope that would minimise the likelihood of anything remotely similar to Windrush happening in the future. So it becomes doubly baffling when you see it through that lens.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And certainly one of the lessons learned from Windrush is that the Home Office needs to be more open and transparent. So to have an exercise in kind of being so unopen and untransparent about this report is really, really very, very strange.
You mentioned a couple of times that students of the era, particularly of Empire, will be unsurprised by the findings. I'm embarrassed to admit that I'm not in that category. I am surprised that it was so bald, if you like, and so blatant. What sort of legislation are we talking about, Amelia?
So there were 4 really critical bits of immigration and nationality legislation passed between the 1960s and the 1980s that went a long way to kind of trying to restrict the principle of freedom of movement that there'd been before. So from the 1940s onwards, if you lived anywhere in the kind of former empire, if you lived anywhere in the Commonwealth, you had the right to come to Britain. So you could come from Jamaica to the UK without any border control. And from the 50s and 60s onwards, that began to be restrained. And some of the ways that this was done were very kind of backhanded in a way, because there was an attempt not to appear to be racist in the legislation, but there were clever ways of actually being racist without saying so, and this report highlights a couple of them. Firstly, if you wanted to travel after 1968, after legislation passed in 1968 from the Commonwealth, you had to prove that you had a connection to the UK through having a parent or a grandparent who'd been born there. And that favoured people coming from white Commonwealth countries like Canada, Australia, settler colonies, where there would be more people whose grandparents had been born in the UK.
Because they'd be returning to roots rather than transferring.
Exactly. So, and it disfavoured people coming from the Caribbean. And again, the 1971 Immigration Act talked in similar ways about people who were patrials, people who had grandparents born in the UK, again favouring movement of people from Canada and Australia against people from Jamaica or Caribbean countries.
What response?
So that the report is very clear. This Home Office commissioned report is very clear that this is just a euphemism for this notion of belonging that is highlighted in the legislation is just a euphemism for being white.
What response have you had from government or from the Home Office now that they know you've got hold of the report?
Well, again, we assent on publication of this kind of article, a very standard response from the Home Office, where they stress that the department is making progress towards becoming more compassionate and towards becoming a more open organisation. And that's, again, the line that we've been sent today. So
no prospect, no explanation of the failure to publish, and no prospect of imminent publication.
It's really, really odd. We're certainly going to go on asking questions and trying to find out why it is or what it was in this document that they found so unpalatable and were so unwilling to make public or even to expose their own staff to.
And finally, I mean, we should point out that it covers a period when both major parties were in power. So, I mean, it can't even be described as exclusively embarrassing for the Conservative Party, can it?
Correct. I mean, legislation in the 20th century was passed by both Labour and the Conservatives, and the concern over immigration was cross-party. But also, I suppose it's important to note that this report looks at the historical roots of the Windrush scandal. It doesn't look at the kind of more recent immediate triggers, and it's important to reiterate that the kind of the clearest cause of the scandal lies in the hostile environment policies passed when Theresa May was Home Secretary, when David Cameron was Prime Minister, and really do lie within this current administration's approach to Home Office policies.
Indeed. Amelia Gentleman, as I mentioned, that story's on the front page of today's Guardian, and clearly it is not over yet. Many thanks for your time this morning. I'll read you, if I may, a quick quote from a letter that the Prime Minister of the Federation of the West Indies, Sir Grantley Adams, sent to Harold Macmillan, the Conservative Prime Minister. Britain has begun to take steps. This is cited in the history. Britain has begun to take steps which are no different in kind to the basis on which the system of apartheid in South Africa is based. That was his description of the introduction of the 1962 Commonwealth Immigrants Act. So once again, you can see why so much effort is being put into inflating this nonsensical phrase anti-woke, which usually just means anti-racist, because despite commissioning Tony Sewell to publish a report arguing that there is no such thing as institutional racism in Britain, allowing Boris Johnson to stand up and say for centuries our United Kingdom has had a proud history of welcoming people from overseas, the facts, once again, belie a very different story. The facts are incredibly different. And I wasn't being falsely modest when I said to Amelia Gentleman a moment ago that I am shocked by this, because I mean, I'm a lot more up on 20th century British history with regards to the Commonwealth and the Empire than I was 5 years ago, even perhaps 5 months ago, thanks to Satnam Sanghera. But I'm stunned. If you're black, I don't think you will be. And that's what we'll talk about next. 0345 60 60973. How does this story make you feel? You know, you might have turned this station on at some points in the past and been told that you were playing the race card, or that you had a chip on your shoulder, or that, you know, if you don't like it here, you should go back where you came from. And now you have a Home Office commissioned report concluding that between 1950 and 1981, official government policy under both major parties was essentially directed towards reducing the number of people here who had dark skin. How does that make you feel today? 0345 60 60973 is the number that you need. And I mean, I know you won't ring me, but if you're a massive racist, how do you feel about the fact that they were doing what you wanted for all that time, when you were still chomping at the bit every day and you know, she won't let you see the kids and all that kind of thing, when the government were doing their best to keep dark-skinned people out of this country for the best part of 3.5 decades? 18 minutes after 11 is the time. I mean, if we lived in an objective reality, then a suppressed report on the origins of a scandal that hurt people in unimaginable ways, British people, would be major news for all of us. But because it's a suppressed report on the origin of the Windrush scandal that only hurt a very particular and specific type of British person in unimaginable ways, it isn't necessarily going to be picked up by all corners of the British media. I mean, you know, 3 decades of racist immigration laws designed to reduce the UK's non-white population, and that is not the opinion of a pundit. It's the conclusion of a historian commissioned by Priti Patel's Home Office to look into the roots of the Windrush scandal. So why do you think they haven't published it? And that's not a rhetorical question. 0345 60 60973. And how do you feel about, I mean, how cross are you with people like me for being surprised by this, when for you it's your lived reality, it's your family's lived experience of the last 50 years? I find it astonishing that the rearguard action against racism in this country is gathering pace at the moment. In 2022, the effort being put into dismissing the reality of racism or even reinvigorating the reality of racism far outstrips the effort being put into resisting it. The whole anti-woke, I nearly swore then, the whole anti-woke rubbish is designed almost exclusively to let people say racist things again without feeling embarrassed or getting into trouble. It's just so obvious and so transparent. And here we are, looking at a period of British history during which political correctness took hold, or during which people were told they can't say what they want to say. And all that time, governments of both flavours were bringing in, I mean, imagine the 1962 Commonwealth Immigrants Act, a voucher system by which a limited number of migrants from the Commonwealth were permitted to enter the UK. So you could die while serving in the British Army, but you couldn't come and live in Britain if you were from the West Indies, unless you had the right vouchers, unless you had the right family links. And then that notion of belonging as a euphemism for white, the fact that if you were Canadian, then your forebears had moved to Canada from the United Kingdom, and that gave you priority when it came to coming to live here. Whereas if you were from the West Indies and your forebears had been enslaved by people from the United Kingdom, then you were less welcome. Deliberately and demonstrably, man alive, I'll stop talking now. This isn't my story, it's yours. Cassius in Ilford. Cassius, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. How are you?
I'm all right, mate. What's on your mind?
The first thing I'll say, I don't blame you. I'm not angry at you. It's got to be a lived experience to understand. So my story, quite briefly, 1984, a cousin of mine wanted to come to England from Antigua for a visit. Turned up at the airport, Antigua, part of the Commonwealth, etc., and pretty much was told, no, you can't come in. We're going to deport you straight back out to Antigua because we don't believe you say you've got a job in Antigua to go back to. We think you're going to come in and stay here illegally. It took letters from, I think my aunt had to go down to the airport with a letter from, I think, a local MP, a letter from herself of invitation to say he's not staying here, he's going back. In the end, after being in the airport for about 14 hours, they let him in. But they said, you have 2 weeks, and if you're not back at the airport on this day to fly out, we'll be coming basically to come and deport you. So he turned up at the airport on the day they said, sat him on a plane at the back of the plane on his own.
Wow. In
some kind of weird seat. And he vowed at the time never, ever to come back to England again. I mean, subsequently, he's grown up a bit. We were both 20-ish at the time. I think he's 19, I was 20. So he has come back. Yeah. But it took years for him to finally say, I'm going back there. Because he could not believe, I've got a job. I don't want to come to England. I've got a job. I live in Antigua. What am I coming here for?
No, of course. I'm coming to visit family. I mean, literally. Yeah. And the idea of that happening to a Canadian in 1984 is pretty close to unimaginable, isn't it?
Nah, I don't think it would happen.
Nor do I. Do you know what? I'm just thinking now, and this is going to make me sound really, really stupid, but the rise of UKIP and the EDL and the BNP and all the rest of them was perhaps a reaction post-1980s to the sense that the traffic was no longer moving in that direction, that actually we were becoming a less racist society. I'm not looking for silver linings, and I know this happened in 84, but I've often been baffled by what they were so cross about, apart from the existence in this country of people like you. But on a subtler level, what they were so cross about is perhaps almost they could sense it in the wind that 3 decades of deliberately racist immigration policies, especially when Thatcher lost power, were beginning to possibly move into reverse. And suddenly, at around about that time, late 90s, well, early 90s onwards, you got the rise of these new-looking far-right individuals and parties. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, yeah, there was a movement, you could say, a subtle movement. I don't want to say the word tolerated. I don't want to be tolerated.
No, of course
but there was an acceptance that, yes, it was changing. The population was, the demographic was changing across the country, and there was becoming more acceptance and
did you get any media? Did you get any media interest in your cousin's story? Or you probably didn't even try to, did you?
No, at the time, no. So literally, I only heard once he came on, I was 20, so I only found out this was big people's business. You know, they didn't tell me what was going on until he turned up. At the house. We had a conversation. So I didn't even know that was going on until he finally turned up at our house, or my aunt's house, I think, at the time.
Good grief! Awful for him as well, of course. I mean, you know, on a deeper level than he may even articulate to friends and family. I mean, the likelihood of the media being interested. The Sun was edited at the time by its disgraced former editor Kelvin Mackenzie, so the likelihood of the case of a young black man like that being taken up by the best-selling newspaper in the country at the time was, I suspect, pretty slim. Thank you, Cassius. Josh is in Brussels. Josh, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. How are you?
I'm good, Josh. I don't have a huge amount of time left before the news, so let's crack on.
You probably don't know. Right, I'm black. I come from Caribbean descent. And the question, you said, how do we feel about it? Most black people who are of that generation won't be surprised by these kind of things. The real question is, it's still going on now. The only difference is that it's much harder to hide. So what I continue to see, so just to quickly reference back to something, the people need to remember that people from the West Indies or the Caribbean were invited to come to Britain after World War II to rebuild the country. There was never a problem for nurses, people driving buses, etc., until there were labour issues and until there were housing issues. Then you started to have the National Front and the BNP. These guys only popped up